There are people in the world right now who haven't spoken to their mother in 3 years, who don't know their father's phone number anymore, by choice, who sit at someone else's holiday table and smile and nod and quietly carry something no one else in the room can see. A particular kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name because it wasn't caused by death. It was caused by a decision they made themselves and have spent every day since either defending, doubting, or quietly grieving. And the world doesn't really have a language for that. We have language for losing someone to illness. We have rituals for death, the flowers, the funeral, the casseroles that show up at your door. We have entire cultural frameworks for how to mourn a person you lost against your will. But we have almost nothing for the person who chose to lose someone, who decided after years and years of trying that the relationship was costing more than it was giving, who woke up one day and realized that the people who were supposed to be their home had become instead a kind of wound that only reopened every time they walked back through the door. That decision, the one to step away from family, is one of the most misunderstood acts a human being can make. And if you've made it, you already know this. You know the look people give you when you say it, the slight pause, the way their face rearranges itself, the question that always follows, but why? Couldn't you just... And then the sentence trails off because they don't quite know what they're suggesting. Forgive more? Try harder? Want less? Be different than you are? What I want to do today is sit with this honestly. Not to tell you that cutting off family is always right or always wrong. Not to hand you a diagnosis or a label or a 5-step framework for healing. But to look at what actually happens inside a person who reaches that point. The psychology of it. The grief of it. And more than anything, to say clearly and without flinching, the people who walk away from their families are not cold. They are not dramatic. They are almost never the ones who gave up too easily. They are, almost always, the ones who tried the longest. For some people, that invisible wall is built over a single dramatic event. A betrayal, an abuse, a line crossed that cannot be uncrossed. But for many, and this is the part that rarely gets acknowledged, there was no single thing. There was just a slow, steady accumulation. Researchers call it microtrauma, the repeated small experiences that don't look like much in isolation, but compound over time into something that fundamentally reshapes how safe you feel in your own body. It's the sigh that comes when you say something honest, the joke at your expense that everyone laughs at, including you, because what else are you supposed to do? The way your achievements are received with slightly less warmth than your failures are received with criticism, the offhand comment about your weight at Christmas. The way your needs, when you finally gathered the courage to name them, were turned back into a conversation about someone else's. None of those things sound catastrophic. That's the point. That's why people who've experienced them spend so long wondering if they're overreacting, if they're too sensitive, if something is fundamentally wrong with them for finding it all so exhausting. Because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. There are no visible bruises, no obvious crime scene. Just a person who drives 3 hours to sit at a table where they feel invisible, who does this year after year after year because leaving feels like betrayal, and hope is a very hard thing to let go of when it's pointed at the people who raised you. Dr. Carl Pillemer at Cornell spent years studying family estrangement, not from the outside looking in, but by actually talking to the people who'd lived it, hundreds of them. And what he found goes against almost everything we naturally assume about this. The people who estranged from a parent or sibling were not impulsive. They were not cold. They were not people who walked away the first time things got hard. They were people who had, in almost every case, spent years, sometimes decades, trying. Years of conversations that went nowhere. Years of apologies that never came. Years of the same argument cycling back around with different words but the same ending. Years of hoping that this time something would shift, that something would finally be seen or heard or acknowledged. And then one day, something else happened. Not an explosion, not a final dramatic confrontation where everything was said. More often, it was quieter than that. It was just a realization, slow and heavy and undeniable, that the cost of staying had become higher than the cost of leaving, that the relationship wasn't making them more, it was making them less themselves, less present in their own life, less capable of the very intimacy and love that the relationship was supposedly built on. That's not giving up. That's not being dramatic. That is a person who has done the accounting, who has sat with the numbers for years and has finally allowed themselves to believe what the numbers say. But here's where it gets psychologically complicated, and this is the part that almost no one talks about. Even when you know the relationship was hurting you, even when you have evidence, even when you've processed it, even when leaving was genuinely the right thing, the grief doesn't follow logic. It doesn't arrive in proportion to the harm. It arrives in proportion to the love. Because you don't cut off people you didn't love. You cut off people you loved too much, in situations where that love had nowhere safe to go. There's a concept sometimes described as the empty well, the experience of returning again and again to a source you hoped would nourish you, finding it dry, and still not being able to fully accept that it isn't going to fill. Something in us, something very old and very deep, keeps believing that if we just come back one more time, if we just say the right thing, if we finally find the exact right key, the well will be full. The love will be what we needed it to be. The parent will become the parent. The sibling will become the sibling. That hope is not weakness. That hope is what it looks like to love someone who cannot quite love you back in the way you need. It's a kind of loyalty that survives far past the point it should, because the alternative, fully accepting that the well is empty, is a grief so specific and so total that most people aren't ready for it until they've exhausted every other option. And when they finally get there, when they finally let themselves stop going back to the well that was never going to fill, what often follows is something unexpected, something that takes them completely by surprise. Quiet. Not peace exactly, not happiness, but quiet. The particular silence of a noise that's been playing so long you forgot it was noise. The strange, disorienting stillness of a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was separate from you, that it wasn't just your normal baseline. And that quiet, that is not indifference. That is what relief feels like when it finally arrives in a person who stopped believing they deserved it. But the quiet doesn't last forever, because underneath it there is something waiting, something that has to be looked at eventually. The grief isn't just for the relationship that ended, it's for something older than that, something that began long before the decision to leave was even on the table. It's grief for the parent they needed and didn't get, for the childhood that happened instead of the one that should have, for the version of themselves that might have existed if they'd grown up feeling truly unconditionally seen. That is a different kind of mourning altogether, and it is
one that our culture has almost no framework for, because it requires mourning someone who is still alive, mourning a relationship that technically still exists somewhere in the world, just not in your life anymore. And the cruelest part of that grief is that it doesn't arrive once and then leave. It arrives in waves, at inconvenient moments, in grocery stores and holiday tables, and quiet Sunday mornings when you see someone else's family laughing together and feel something move through your chest that you can't quite name. But here is what I want you to hold on to, if you hold on to nothing else from this. That grief, the relentless, shape-shifting, ambiguous grief of estrangement, is not evidence that you made the wrong choice. It is evidence that you are human, that you loved, that somewhere inside you there was a child who wanted nothing more than to be safe and seen by the people who made them, and that child deserved that, fully, without condition. The guilt is not a verdict, it is a scar, and scars don't mean the wound is still open, they mean it closed. Healing from this kind of loss isn't about reaching a day where you feel nothing. It isn't about becoming someone who can tell the story without flinching. It's much smaller and much more important than that. It's about learning to extend to yourself the compassion you kept trying to earn from someone who couldn't give it. It's about building, slowly and deliberately, a life where your needs are not an inconvenience, where who you actually are, not the smaller, quieter, more palatable version, is genuinely welcome. You don't have to explain your peace to anyone. If any part of this story lived inside you before you ever heard it spoken out loud, then you already know. You've known for a while, and you're not alone in that knowing, not even close. If this resonated, not just in your mind, but somewhere quieter, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of the human experience, the next video is already waiting for you.